Now, I realise it's a bit of a standing joke that I often mention McDonald's in my sermons, and you're probably missing that because I haven't mentioned them for a while, so not wanting to let you down, I've thought of a way to introduce a sermon by talking about McDonald's, so here we go. So McDonald's, they offer this thing where you can do your order on an app, and then you drive to the restaurant and you sit in the car park in one of the bays and they bring you out the food. The trouble is, a few times I've done this, you do the order and you sit outside in one of the bays. They don't always bring it out, and you're sitting in your car thinking, well, it's been 2 minutes, it's been 5 minutes, but how long do we wait? Once I waited, must have been about 10 minutes or so, and I went in and I said, look, I've been waiting for my order, what's happened? And they went to look, and my order was sat on the side being ignored by everyone. It had been completely forgotten. It was a case of out of sight, out of mind. They were just ignoring my order. People who are out of sight can often be out of mind. They can be overlooked, forgotten. And sometimes that just happens. It happens because life is busy and there's so many other things to think about, and you realise, whoa, I haven't seen that person for ages now. Or maybe someone who's out of sight is inconvenient because you have to go and actually visit them or whatever. It's costly to remember them. People who are out of sight can easily be overlooked and forgotten. And Paul was in a Roman prison. He was out of sight, perhaps out of mind. It was certainly costly to go and visit Paul. Now, he wasn't completely forgotten, but he was isolated. He felt isolated. We're going to think about that in our first point, isolated Christians. Many years ago, Claire and I were in Kenya just helping out a few missionaries doing some stuff, and there was a single guy who was there as a missionary sent by his church. I think he was in his 30s. He was a strong guy. He had fashioned these homemade weights out of concrete and scaffold poles, so you can imagine this big bloke. And he came across as a big person sort of spiritually and physically. And then one day, he just opened up about how desperately lonely he was. The other missionaries, they were great, but most of them had families. And he found himself just feeling so isolated and so alone in that place. He was a big man, but his eyes were full of big tears. I didn't know what to say because everything that came to mind just seemed so trite and. But what he really needed was some brothers and sisters to come round him, to be with him, to look out for him, to invite him into their homes. He needed human love and friendship. I don't think this is that rare, actually, especially when you are isolated from your friends and your family. Maybe you have to move around from place to place or whatever. You can feel isolated. Now, we should really value the freedom and the opportunity that we have to come into a fellowship like this week by week and just enjoy getting to know each other. We have this freedom, and we probably don't really appreciate just how valuable it is. Some Christians would love to be able to just freely come and meet together like this. But this is why church lunches and those sorts of things are so important. It's not just important for you, it's actually for the other people in the church, for the people who perhaps don't have a family or don't have those around them. It's just so precious to come together as a church family and say, yeah, how are you doing? And spend some time together. Paul couldn't just go to church. He was a prisoner. Now, to be fair, he had sent some of those supporters, some of those people around him, he'd sent them off himself, but we'll get to them later. But let's look at what contributed to his isolation, verses 10 and 11. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. So Crescens and Titus, we can assume they're about legitimate kingdom work, and they've gone off to do their work, but that's taken them away from Paul. So that's the point. They've gone out away from Paul. But as for Demas, he's deserted Paul. He's deserted the work. Demas is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. Once in Philemon 24, once in Colossians chapter 4, and every time it's in relation to Luke. So it's a bit of a team, Luke and Demas and Paul, a bit of a team there. The other 2 times he's mentioned is positive. He's worked alongside them, sending greetings and all the rest of it. But now it's not positive. He's run away. He's deserted the team. We're not given the juicy details there, just that he loved the world. That's in contrast to verse 8. Do you remember all those, we're going to get the crown, the victor's crown. They were the ones who loved his appearing, loving the Lord, waiting, longing for him to come back. But Demas apparently was not loving the Lord and his appearing. He is loving the world. So there's a contrast there. Demas appeared to be running the race. He appeared to be faithful, fully engaged in the gospel work, and maybe he was for that time, but something's happened, something's come in, knocked Christ away from his heart, and he's living for the world. He loves the world. He's stopped running the race. He's given up. And who knows what became of him? Did he ever get restored like Mark was? We meet Mark in the next bit, don't we? He was restored. He deserted Paul once, but he got restored. We don't know what happened to Demas. He was running the race. He's now gone off. He's chasing the world, loving the world. Don't know what happens to him. It's something to be on our guard against, isn't it? If someone like Demas can be such a loyal gospel worker and then suddenly he just deserts it all, we need to be on our guard against that, don't we? No matter how strong you think you are. The sad reality is that those who appear to be strong Christians, running the race, so those who perhaps even served with us, who are going on well, they can fall away and desert Christ. So we need to watch ourselves. We need to examine ourselves. We need to take the time to draw near to God. I'm always saying this, but it's just so vital, isn't it? We need to draw near to God. Fight for it. I've got to have that time with the Lord. Seek the Lord daily. Do whatever it takes to warm your cold heart towards the Lord. Don't you? You know that coldness in your heart, don't you? You wake up and you go, I just don't feel it today or whatever. And you think, no, I've got to do something. I've got to read his word. I've got to seek the Lord. I've got to talk to another Christian. I've got to put on some worship songs or something. I need to warm my heart. Cry out to the Lord. Don't neglect prayer. Seek first his kingdom. Keep feeding yourself the word of God. Encourage one another. Let's not neglect meeting together. It's so important. The Bible is full of encouragements to help us keep going. Because like in any fight or in any race, there will be times when we just think, I just don't want to do this anymore. Maybe that's what happened to Demas. Something came in, won his heart, took him off. Maybe he got fed up with the hard work, the constant danger, living in poverty because of the gospel. Whatever it is, this love for the world, it usurped his love for Christ and he deserted Paul. We've got to watch ourselves. We need to. Well, at least Paul had good old Luke. Good old Luke. He's a faithful brother, isn't he? He always seems to be there. But Luke on his own doesn't seem to be enough. Why was that? Well, no offense to Luke, but I guess he had a lot to do. He had to try and make a living to support himself and Paul. He was trying to carry out all the mission work because Paul's in prison. He's got letters to write, to deliver, lots of things to do. And it's just probably too much for one man, for Luke, just to be helping Paul out. So despite Luke's efforts, it seems there is this element of loneliness for Paul. He longs to see Timothy. So flip back to chapter 1, verse 4. Recalling your tears, Paul says, I long to see you. Do you see that? I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. Luke's great, but it doesn't mean Luke's anything missing with him, but Paul longs to see his spiritual son. He's just his heart's aching for him. He's missing this beloved brother. Now, there are some who imagine that it's a great sign of spiritual maturity not to need other people. Do you know? And sometimes I've caught myself saying this. I don't really need anyone else. I'm fine on my own. I don't really need to go to church. I'm a strong Christian. I don't need other people. But, I don't think it's a sign of spiritual maturity. I think, if anything, it's a sign of pride or completely misunderstanding how discipleship works, because we need each other. That's why Christ has saved us into a fellowship like this. We need each other to encourage, to rebuke, to do all those things, to shine the light on the area of our lives that isn't quite right. But we need each other. You might not think it, but it just means you need it even more. Of course, times of isolation can be really helpful. Going away, spending time with the Lord, that's really valuable. But we're not to live in isolation. We are to live in community. It's how God made us. See, it's interesting, isn't it? Even when Adam walked with the Lord, so he had a close fellowship with the Lord, God still said, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. See, the Lord made us to be in community, to have company. And I just want to point out, when you feel lonely, that doesn't mean you're deficient. It's not sinful to feel lonely. It's not like, I must be so spiritually weak. No, it's being human. It's normal. We're made in God's image. And God is triune. He is in perfect relationship in three persons. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is not lonely. In the Godhead, there is the perfect and most fulfilling fellowship. And we need fellowship. We need each other. If you have a good support network around you, that's great. Don't take that for what's the word? Granted. Thank you. Yeah, that's what happens when you go off your notes. Don't take it for granted. It's valuable to have people around you to love and support you. And I think it's incumbent upon those who are well supported to look out for those who aren't. So, even in a crowded room, you can feel so lonely, can't you? I'm sure we've all been there. Maybe after church and everyone's talking to each other and you're kind of just standing there and you think, you can feel a bit lonely, can't you? I hope we're looking out for each other, those people on their own. It's really good when people come in and they often say this is a welcoming church, and that's a report I often hear. And that's brilliant. Praise the Lord for that, because not every church is really. But that's something special. Praise the Lord for that, but we can do that even more, can't we? We can be even more welcoming. Watching out not just for the new people, but the people who are on their own, who often get left on their own. So I've got a challenge for you. How about after this service, you go up and speak to someone you've never spoken to before? How about we're really brave and we try and do that? And they'll know what you're doing because they've heard the same thing as you. So that'd be great, wouldn't it? You could do that every week. My challenge this week is to speak to someone I don't even know their name of. It's embarrassing, but go on, we can do this. So anyway, loneliness can be an issue in pretty much any area of life. A Christian can feel isolated in their workplace. A Christian can feel isolated in their home life, especially if they're the only Christian in that home. It's helpful to think, well, how can we help each other? How can we support each other? That's why home groups are quite helpful. It gives us that fellowship in the midweek. But it's helpful to think, how can we help each other in these times? What about those who are unable to actually leave their homes? Those who are ill and can't get out. What about, it's good that we can stream the service, isn't it? That's really valuable, and I know many benefit from that. But that's not the same, is it? It's not enough just to watch a service, because you need that real fellowship. What about those Christians who have to go into care homes? I mean, it's good when there's a Christian care home, because there's fellowship there. But it's that thing of out of sight, out of mind. Easy to forget these people that have to go into these homes. Or what about when we think about even further afield, believers who are on the mission field or believers in prison, as Paul was? I'm not going to say, what can we do about this? Because it's easy to say, we should be doing something. So we should be doing something. We all agree that. I think it's more helpful to say, well, what can you be doing about this? So that's a bit more personal, isn't it? What can you be doing? How can you be looking out for isolated believers? There's many Christians who feel isolated. You might be sitting next to one of them. So let's just consider, in our second point, the sort of things that Paul requests for his help. How can we help and how can we support? What did Paul request? Let's look at that in our second point, help and support. During the pandemic, Zoom was very helpful, and a lot of us became acquainted with technology that we're not used to, and it was wonderful, wasn't it? In the isolation, we could see our friends and family, we could speak to them, and that was great. But during the pandemic, we quickly became aware that actually seeing people on a screen, it was wonderful, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't the same as being with someone, with giving someone a hug and a squeeze and seeing their reaction and, I don't know, smelling them and just all those, I don't know, maybe that's a good thing, but yeah, it's just those things of that personal contact, that just being in the same room as someone. You lose so much, don't you, when it's on a screen. And that's what Paul wanted. He could write to Timothy, he could get reports about Timothy, but he wants to see him in the flesh. We've already mentioned in chapter 1, verse 4, how Paul longed to see Timothy. And again, in this chapter we're looking, chapter 4, verse 9, do your best to come to me soon. And then again, in verse 21, do your best to come before winter. Paul clearly wants to see Timothy as soon as possible. Why the urgency there? Well, as we saw last week, Paul is convinced that his ministry, his life is all but over. He's going to be departing soon to glory. But there's also this winter that is approaching. And in those days, when winter approached, you couldn't really travel, especially by boat. It was really dangerous. So you didn't travel by boat in the winter. And if Timothy delays too much, he's not going to be able to leave. He's not going to be able to travel. He's not going to get to see Paul before he dies. And so Paul is saying, come on, Timothy, you need to come soon as you can. Paul wants a face-to-face with Timothy. And actually that gives us insight into how we can help and support those more isolated of believers. A text, a phone call, it's good, isn't it? That's helpful, that's really good. But sometimes there's just nothing quite like having a face-to-face with another believer. There's other ways that Paul needed help and support too. He tells Timothy in verse 13, when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all, the parchments. So here we have some really practical matters in which Paul wanted or required help. It was getting cold. Winter was going to be approaching soon. Paul was an old man, probably felt the cold as well. So he asks for his cloak. That cloak, it would have been a round garment with a hole in the middle, and you stick your head in. And it's not the sort of thing you could just replace easily. You couldn't pop down to Primark and get, a couple for 20 quid. There was a massive investment. Clothes were very, very expensive. So you couldn't just replace this thing. Now, why had he left it with Carpus? Well, we don't really know. Perhaps he'd been arrested in that area and in the confusion, and he hadn't been able to go back and get it. So he had to leave it there with a trusted guy, probably with the person he was staying with, and he hasn't got all his stuff. But this just demonstrates that Paul, in all his godliness, in all his being able to learn to be content in whatever circumstances, despite all that, actually, he's not willing to suffer if he doesn't have to. It's not, well, I'm just going to deal with this suffering if you don't need to. If he can get his coat, he's going to have his coat. So it's not like, well, it doesn't matter. If there's a way to ease the suffering, he will. He's called to suffer. He will suffer. But if he doesn't have to suffer, he's not going to suffer. It's quite simple, isn't it? So Timothy could practically help Paul by picking up this coat on the way and bringing it to Paul. But what has Paul's coat got to do with us? Well, it's good to remember that vulnerable Christians often have very physical needs. And it's not unspiritual. We've got our needs and we need them met, don't we? So, food, and warmth and security. Often we can't help because we don't know who's in that situation or whatever, but there are organisations that are around that we can think, okay, you can link up with those Christians I can't, so I'm going to give to you. And these organisations can help people, not just spiritually, but with their physical needs. It's also good to remember that gospel workers have physical needs too. Now, I'm not saying that because I do. This church is really generous. It looks after me and my family really well, so I'm not saying this for our sakes at all. But a gospel worker, like any believer, should be willing to accept sacrifice and suffering. But if they do struggle, then a church should be looking at how can I meet their needs. Gospel workers shouldn't struggle if they don't need to struggle. So Paul is making Timothy aware of a very practical need. And a gospel worker, an isolated Christian, whoever that might be, will have all kinds of practical needs. And it's only right that the church address those needs. But also, closely related, is Paul's needs for his books. He needs his books. Paul, he couldn't concentrate on his ministry if it was cold. Our physical comfort actually distracts us from our work, doesn't it, sometimes? So he needs to be warm. But actually he needs his books as well. Precisely what those books and those parchments are, we don't know. Suggestions, so it could be copies of the Old Testament. It could be early collections of Jesus' sayings. We just don't know, but they were helpful for Paul in his studies. And of course, most Christian ministries, in fact, all gospel-serving things that we do, they require resources, don't they? If you run a youth group, you need resources. I'm not dropping hints from myself at all here. We're well supplied, but it's worth noting, if we expect someone to serve, we need to give them the tools to serve with, don't we? If we want elders to elder, we need to give them time and resources and space to do that, free them up from other ministries so that they can do that. If we want deacons to deacon, if we want youth leaders to lead, we want cleaners to clean, musicians to play, if we want leaflets to give out and courses to run, there needs to be the equipment and the tools to enable them to do what they're called to do. It's just straightforward. It's not rocket science, is it? That's true for local churches, but it's also true for missionaries and gospel workers all over. So for isolated Christians, pastors, gospel workers, missionaries, imprisoned believers, there will be practical needs to supply. They'll also need resources to help them do their work. It will be good for the health of a church, good for the gospel, if those trying to serve have the necessary resources. It's really frustrating, isn't it, when you try and run something and the church has got half the things missing, or it's just poorly organised, or it just hasn't got what it needs to do its job. It's really frustrating. And here's a thought for you. If it's not good enough for you, probably not good enough for the church either. It's almost like the church becomes a charity shop sometimes, doesn't it? I know we mean it well, but I don't want all this stuff now because I've got new, better ones. I'll give it to the church. Sometimes it's vital. It's the only way the church can get stuff. But, if it doesn't do the job properly for you, it's probably not going to do the job properly for the church either. But, the church might not actually need your money. It might. It might not need your stuff. It might. But what it actually might need is you. It's you. Notice Paul, he asks Timothy, halfway through verse 11, get Mark, the former deserter. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me in my ministry. Sometimes when we think about supporting gospel work and workers, we just think money and we just think prayer, and those things are vital to any ministry and any church. Of course they are. But actually, sometimes I wonder if we need to consider, is it actually me the Lord wants? My service, my gifts, my time. Is it me who needs to go? You see, Paul doesn't want to... Paul, obviously, he wants to see Timothy. His heart longs for Timothy. But also at the heart of his requests is a real gospel concern. This is what underlines all of his things here. There's a gospel focus. Get Mark. Why? Because he's very useful to me in my ministry. That's Paul's big concern. He wants to be able to continue to serve the Lord for as long as he's got. He doesn't know how long that is. He knows it's coming to an end. But he wants to continue to serve the Lord and exercise his ministry. He needs friendship for that. He needs warmth. He needs tools. He needs useful people. Paul doesn't ask for just anyone to come. Can we have any volunteers? Doesn't matter who you are. Just roll up and come and keep Paul company. That's not the point. Paul's not desperate. He calls for someone he knows will be useful to him. Useful. He doesn't want people to just stand around looking decorative like a load of holy ornaments. He wants people who are useful for the gospel service, to do something. Now, what does it mean to be useful? It's a very healthy attitude, I think, to come into a church, to say, right, I'm coming here to be useful. What a wonderful, refreshing thought that would be. If we say, right, Sunday morning, Monday morning, so whenever it is, I want to be a useful believer. Well, what does that mean? Well, of course it means being available. It means able to volunteer and get involved. But it also requires a certain level of ability. So it's no use if you volunteer to drive someone if you can't drive. You've got to have the necessary gifts, haven't you? Or you think, well, I want to cook someone a dinner, but your dinner's a stink, I mean, that's not going to be a blessing to anyone, is it? We have to be real about this. We're not all gifted in the same way. And we have to go to where our gifts are. Certain people are more suited to certain tasks. But I hope our attitude to the kingdom, to the church, to the gospel is, I want to be useful. And actually, I know I can do this, so I'm going to try and do that. Or there's this need here. I don't particularly want to do it, but I can do it, so I'm going to do that. By the way, I think there's a list of jobs just as you go out on the right. Just if you need inspiration for how you can be useful, maybe we should put at the top of that, useful tasks or something. In his predicament, Paul needed fellowship, he needed practical help, he needed spiritual supplies, he needed useful people. And the needs of the gospel workers and isolated Christians in the church, it really hasn't changed much. We need all those things, don't we? Especially useful people. Well, Paul may have been isolated, but rising above it all is a gospel strategy, a gospel purpose. And that's our final point, a gospel purpose. What did Paul want to do? Verse 17, we're going to look at these verses a bit more next week, but verse 17, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. We're going to deal with verses 14 to 18 next week, but this is the common goal. This is the common understanding of all those who were close to Paul, all those who were fellow workers who stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the gospel work. This is their desire. Their overriding concern was that the gospel would be preached. This is the thing that kept them together, united in the Lord, united in this one thing. It's how the chapter started. Timothy, preach the word. Fulfill your ministry. Paul shows Timothy, even at Paul's own trial, that was an opportunity. He was preaching the gospel at his own. I mean, of all the times you would think, right, just rein it in, Paul, just say the right things, get through this. He said, no, this is the perfect opportunity. I'm going to preach the gospel, and he did. That's how you fulfill your ministry. That's how you make the most of every opportunity. He's showing Timothy, don't miss those opportunities. As I was reading this in the week, I was struck by the strategic nature of it all. It's like Paul is almost like at the hub, the centre of all these gospel operations, and all these people are coming and going. It's the network that's happening. Verse 10, Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. There's no rebuke for them there, so they're probably off on legitimate kingdom business, just doing the stuff that they need to do. Obviously, there's Demas, the less said about him, the better. Then there's Carpus, who's looking after Paul's stuff. Verse 20, we've got Erastus, he remained in Corinth. Verse 12, Tychicus, sent by Paul to Ephesus. Tychicus was probably the one carrying this very letter that we're reading, so he did a good job. It got there, and that's great. But they all had a part to play. In fact, Tychicus was probably sent there to Ephesus to relieve Timothy so Timothy could come to Paul. So you see, there's all this toing and going, and everyone's doing a little bit. There's this understanding, this willingness to move about, to be useful, to go to where the need is. And again, I hope that's our attitude. Lord, where do you want me to go? What would you have me to do? I think this is the Lord's answer, is be useful. What do you want me to do? Be useful. And in Paul's circle, they all seem to have this underlying gospel thinking. So even when ill health hit one of those gospel workers. So verse 20, halfway through, and I left Trophimus, who was ill at Miletus. Interesting to note, isn't it, that even the Apostle Paul wasn't able to make everyone well at will. Trophimus remained ill. I mean, I guess he was left in people to look after him, but even in that situation, the understanding is, do you know, the show must go on. The gospel still has to go on. The ministries have to happen. It can't just stop because someone is ill. You know, care for him, look after him and everything else, but actually the gospel still has to go on. That's that underlying understanding. The church has got a job to do. Now, we don't know who a lot of these people are. Verse 20, Eubulus, Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all who are all those brothers that are mentioned. We don't know who are they. But for many of these people, we just have barely any information about them at all. But behind every one of those names is a story, isn't there? There's a life lived. There's something that they were doing. So Erastus was staying in Corinth. What did that involve for him? The household of Onesiphorus. Remember him from chapter 1? He went to Rome. He searched diligently for Paul. He couldn't find him, but he found him eventually. He refreshed Paul. And then Paul greets his household, not him. Why doesn't he greet Onesiphorus? Well, maybe Onesiphorus is still there, or maybe Onesiphorus is dead. We don't know. Maybe his gospel service cost him his life. Or maybe Paul is just wishing to greet the whole family. We don't know, but there's a story there. What about Tychicus, seconded to cover Timothy? He's going to have to go and deal with all these false teachers and all the trouble they're stirring up in that place. But he's got the understanding, the gospel understanding. I'm going to go give Timothy that break so he can come and see Paul. That's going to be a blessing to others. He's going to carry on the gospel word. There's Prisca and Aquila, who always seem to be busy for the Lord wherever they are living at the time. And we've got this fine tapestry of interwoven lives. A splendid display of useful believers all doing their bit. There's one here, there's one there, there's one sent, there's one recalled. They serve the same Lord. They have the same purpose. And I hope that that's our underlying understanding too. I'm here to serve the Lord. I'm here to see that the gospel goes out in one way or another. I might not be a frontline preacher, but I can do my bit. I can be useful to the Lord. I can be a blessing to his people. Whoever you are, wherever you go, whatever skills you have, I hope we're thinking, Lord, help me to be useful. NBBC might be tucked away at the edge of Wiltshire. But all believers around the world, we are all connected in Jesus, aren't we? It's not just us in our little corner. We're all connected to all the other believers throughout the world. So let's be those who start to look out for one another. Let's look out for those who are often overlooked and forgotten. Do you know, to my shame, a lot of my missionary magazines, they come through my door and I put them there and think, I'll read that. And then I just replace them with the next one and the next one. That's a challenge, isn't it? Maybe we should be reading these missionary magazines and saying, oh, I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray for my brothers and sisters. Why not? Why don't we do that? Let's look out for those who have a need. Let's consider, how can I support those Christians who are isolated? How can I see the gospel furthered in some way? What is the most strategic way I can be useful in this place with what the Lord has given me? Let's be quiet before the Lord as we think about those things.